You're listening to the To Write Love on Our Arms podcast, a show about mental health and the things that make us human.
I think it's interesting that you brought up these TikToks and these bite-sized videos of information that are now out there. And it really is perfect how that started the conversation, because it provided a platform for people to feel more comfortable expressing the struggles that they deal with and just the way that their brains work. And that's kind of how it tipped off to me. I've dealt with depression and anxiety my whole life, and I've always been diagnosed as such. And it wasn't until I literally saw a TikTok about different symptoms. So I talked to a psychiatrist just through a video, and they straight up were like, "Oh, you graduated college, now you're good. You don't have ADHD." And I was
man.
That seems, no, I don't know about that. So I got a second opinion and went through this whole testing and all of that. And they were like, yeah, you do seem to show some signs of ADHD, but it's mild. And so I was like, okay, interesting. Where do I go from here? So I started seeing a virtual psychiatrist monthly, and just to keep on track and know how to manage my symptoms. And she was like, yeah, you have ADHD. It's all there. I'm like, okay. So my life is starting to make a lot more sense of how I tick. And I was listening to a podcast on the way here called ADHD AF, and it's ADHD as female.
Oh,
yeah.
Plot twist.
Yeah. So I learned that it's a lot harder to get a diagnosis as a woman, especially as an adult woman, because anxiety and depression are comorbid with ADHD. So that's typically what the diagnosis ends up being, which is what I've gotten my whole life.
Yeah.
And after I started ADHD treatment, I started seeing improvements in my life, just understanding how to function, and also just giving myself forgiveness and grace on things that don't seem typical to others. Forgetting to do certain chores, or forgetting that I put my laundry in 10 hours ago and now it's still wet and not dry. And but that it's not a right or wrong. It was interesting in this podcast. They talked about how neurodivergency is just a type of neurological manner of which you think and which your brain works. So being neurotypical or being neurodivergent, there's no this is normal. There is no normal.
Yeah, typical and normal should not be considered synonyms.
Yeah, because if it was, it would be neuronormal.
Right.
So looking at it that way, I was like, that's a good point, because with 7-8 billion people on the planet, there can't be just one kind of person. It just means neurotypical is just most people have this sort of brain process, but not everybody.
I can't help but see Katie nodding.
I'm gonna be doing
so
a
based
lot of
about
that throughout this
every
conversation.
bit that you're talking about, Katie, what brings you to the conversation?
So I've been watching the TikToks, and I'm thinking that maybe this applies to me phase of the situation. I have yet to pursue an official diagnosis or anything like that, but have had a lot of just moments of, oh, that's not how everybody exists and moves through the world. You said something about being able to make look back at your life and understand a lot of things, and that's been true for me too, of just kind of having these moments of, okay, so this is why this is so difficult for me, or this is why I need this in order to be able to function in a way that works for me, and explains a lot of friction, particularly in working relationships, that has existed too, and trying to figure out, okay, how do I then work around that, and figuring out the hacks and things like that. So that's where I am in the process and thinking about it. And then I think partly because of who I am as a person, then also making me think about So if I need accommodations in how I work and how I interact with people, what accommodations do other people potentially need? So like, how do we do that as a group of like, you know, so if I need things to be a certain way in order to work well, but that maybe clashes with how somebody else needs things to be, like, how do we find those compromises to be able to like fit together?
I'm so glad you brought that up. To what degree does empathy change or shift or just evolve really the conversation around these things? Definitely want to, take a moment just to acknowledge how these terms are defined in 2023. So we did do some digging and found that when we're talking about neurodivergence or people that are neurodivergent, the Cleveland Clinic defines that as a non-medical term that describes people whose brains develop or work differently for some reason. This means a person has different strengths and struggles from people whose brains develop in a more typical manner. And we talked earlier, like typical is not normal.
Right. Or better.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the idea that there's 8 billion people sharing this rock. How silly of a exercise it is to try to just make an us or them category.
Yeah, of course.
Because I think if we're all honest, like even while there's 8 billion people on the planet, there's probably still several versions of me that I'm still tapping into. So, and then applying the same strictures to ADHD, just defining that, we're going to be talking mostly about ADHD inattentive type. So the Cleveland Clinic defines people with ADHD of the inattentive type as people that have trouble paying attention to details. They can be easily distracted, often have trouble organizing or finishing tasks, and often forget routine chores, paying bills, transferring laundry, returning phone calls. And this, of course, comes with a number of stereotypes. Let's talk about kind of the confluence of stereotypes and stigma. We'll start with Katie. As someone that is not diagnosed, what are some of the terms that you are either trying to attach piece of your identity to or that you're hoping to distance yourself from?
I mean, I think the main one that comes up with ADHD and the one that people are like very relieved to understand shouldn't apply is the word lazy. Because of the forgetfulness and not even necessarily forgetfulness, but like there's a lack of motivation happening with your executive functioning with ADHD. And so like, for me, like I have to feel motivated to do the thing that I need to do. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. And it's not because I'm lazy. It's because my brain literally just isn't making the chemicals and the energy that I need to be able to focus and do what it is required to fulfill that task. And so that shows up in a lot of different ways, but being able to kind of to take the judgment out of that, to take the morality out of it. One of my favorite creators on TikTok, Casey Davis, she goes by Domestic Blisters on there. She has a book called How to Keep House While Drowning. And she talks a lot about separating the morality from having a clean house, that having a clean house doesn't make you a more moral or better person. And that you just need your house to function in the best way for you. And as long as you can figure out what you need to do in order to have that functioning, then go for it and do that. And so I think, being able to look at my house and look at my quote unquote doom piles and knowing that like other people are going to look at that and say, oh my gosh, messy. And I'm looking at it and going, I know exactly where in that pile that thing is that I might need. And if it gets moved somewhere else, I lose it completely.
do I hear an amen coming from
Totally.
Sabrina?
So understanding that it's like, again, it's not bad or wrong. It's just different.